Hello, everyone, and welcome back. We are now about to start the CBRS Band Progress presentation with Andrew Clegg. Andrew is past president of NSMA, board member. He's the spectrum engineering lead for Google. He presently is focused primarily on identifying spectrum sharing opportunities for wireless broadband networks. He's been integral in the adoption of the 3.5 gigahertz citizens broadband radio service, and as a founding chair of the Functional and Operational Requirements Working Group of the Wireless Innovation Forum. Prior to joining Google, he served from 2003 to 2013 as the electromagnetic spectrum manager for the National Science Foundation. We're super pleased to have Andy. Welcome aboard. And one thing for folks, if you have questions during the session, remember on your right is that chat button. You can just type questions in, and Andy from time to time will be able to sort through them and provide a response. Again, welcome, Andy, and we look forward to the session. I'll come back near the back end for any closeout comments. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, everybody. It's been a good set of sessions this morning already. I have a lot of talent to follow with Danielle and Brian and George. So hopefully I'll be able to continue providing a useful comment and content for people. So I'm here to give a bit of an update on the Citizens Broadband Radio Service, CBRS. So let's dig right in. So I'm going to give a little bit of a refresher on what CBRS is to remind people of what CBRS is. I'll give you an update on the status of CBRS as of now, especially compared to where we were last year at this time when we talked about it at last year's conference. Then I'll concentrate on some of the major developments since last year's conference. For example, the priority access license auction that's been completed. I'll talk about how CBRS is fitting into the 3 gigahertz mid-band spectrum landscape altogether. And then if there's time, I'll say a little bit about where we are with regard to the environmental sensing capability and the informing incumbent capability, which is shaping up to be a significant issue. So let me go into the refresher. So the CBRS operates in the 3.5 gigahertz band. It's an underlay service to incumbents that are already using the band. The primary incumbent in the band is the DoD, and specifically the primary use of the band for DoD is shipborne radars, and at the moment, by number, the greatest number of radars operating in the band on shipborne sense is on aircraft carriers. So that's why there's a picture of an aircraft carrier there. There are a few inland sites also that they operate, but primarily we have to protect their coastal operations. And then the second major incumbent is the non-federal extended C-band earth stations. These are earth stations mostly along the coast that receive signals from foreign satellites. So by rule, in this extended part of C-band, these dishes can only be receiving transmissions from foreign satellites. So CBRS is the new entrant, and the reality is this is the first large-scale commercially deployed shared spectrum implementation that we've seen. TV white space. we implemented TV white space, but it was not widely adopted yet, at least. And again, we share this band with the federal incumbents and the non-federal incumbents, and the new entrant is CBRS. And then this whole thing, the interference in the band is managed by a cloud-based controlling system called a spectrum access system, or a SAS. So I'll get into a little more detail on all of this. So here is the band plan up at the top that gives you an idea of who's operating where. The most important thing are the reddish-orange bars, which are the incumbents, and again, primarily DoD radar that operates at some level or another throughout the band. The band for CBRS is 3550 to 3700 megahertz. It's 150 megahertz of spectrum. The fixed satellite service earth stations operate above 3600, so they don't operate in the entire band. And in fact, some of them don't even go down to 3600, but that's the region that they could operate under. And so those are the incumbents. And then the new entrants, the CBRS, is broken up into two tiers. One is called the Priority Access License, or PAL tier, which I'll describe a little bit in a minute. And then the lower tier of CBRS service is General Authorized Access, or GAA. So there are three tiers altogether in CBRS. There are the incumbents, which are always protected from interference, and then there's two tiers of CBRS service. So the little pyramid down there on the bottom sort of illustrates the interference protection gradient here. The incumbents receive interference protection at all times from CBRS. The priority access licensees, the PALs, must protect incumbents from interference, but they receive interference protection from the lower CBRS tier, which is GAA, and they also receive co-channel interference protection from PALs that are operating in adjacent license areas. And then the lowest tier, GAA, does not by default receive any interference protection. They're sort of like unlicensed, but technically they're licensed. They're called lightly licensed. And PAL is definitely licensed. They have to buy their license at auction, which I'll cover here in a minute. Most of the DoD radar operation is actually in the lower 100 megahertz of the band, mostly in 3550 to 3650. And in coastal areas, the Spectrum Access System, or SAS, operators have to connect to what's called an environmental sensing capability, or ESC, which is a set of sensors, basically radar detectors located along the coastline, that detect when and generally where DoD is operating their radar. It informs the SAS, and the SAS manages interference from devices under its control to mitigate any harmful interference cases. So this is sort of a diagram here of how it all works. On the right in the dotted line are the CBRS users themselves. But on the left is sort of the back end that makes all of this stuff work from an interference perspective. So again, you have the incumbents that are the reddish orange color here. And what we've got showing here is that the Spectrum Access System, which is the system that manages interference from CBRS into the incumbents and within each and among each other, has information about when and where the incumbents are operating. And it does that by a variety of ways. One is the environmental sensing capability, or ESC, that I just described, that basically is a glorified radar detector. And it detects the government, the shipborne radars primarily. Another way is that some of the DoD's radar operations are informed directly to the SAS by way of an informing incumbent portal. So they basically go to a calendar and say, hey, at this site, at this time, on this frequency, we want to operate our system and we want protection. So that's the minority of the way that the incumbent, the DoD radar operations are reported, but it is one way, and it's growing increasingly important, which I'll explain later. And then the non-federal incumbent, the satellite earth stations, the Spectrum Access System, the SAS, knows about them by way of an FCC database. So the SAS connects to the database on a regular basis, downloads the latest information about these incumbent satellite earth stations, so it knows when and where they operate. So the key that makes all of this work is that before any device in the CBRS ecosystem is allowed to transmit, the CBRS base station, which we call a CBRS device, or CBSD, CBRS Radio Service Device, CBSD, before a CBSD transmits, it needs to check with a Spectrum Access System, which it does through an internet connection, and it gives information about where it is, what power it wants to operate on, how high its antenna is, and a number of other factors. The Spectrum Access System takes all of that information, looks at where satellite earth stations are in the area, looks at whether the DoD is operating in the area, and then returns an answer back to the CBSD and says, yes, it's okay to transmit, but I want you to check in every 4 minutes to make sure it's, you're still okay to transmit, because the DoD's radar operations can pop up at a moment's notice. So CBSDs have to continue to check in. But the SAS acts as the controller and manages all of the interference, predicted interference from the CBRS users into the incumbents. So the SAS is sort of the secret sauce that makes all this work. So let me describe a little bit about the two tiers of CBRS service. The top tier of CBRS service is the Priority Access License, or the PAL. And formally, a PAL, a Priority Access License, is one 10 megahertz unpaired frequency block in one license area. And the FCC adopted counties as the licensing area for CBRS. There's 3,233 counties in the US. You see the map there, there's quite a few. But one 10 megahertz unpaired block in one county is a PAL. In any county, the greatest number of PALs that will be licensed is 7. So out of the 150 megahertz of CBRS, the most that you can have operating as PAL spectrum in a given county is 70 megahertz, leaving on average or under good circumstances, that leaves 80 megahertz of general authorized access, or GAA spectrum, left in each county. So if you multiply that out, 7 PALs in each county times 3,233 counties, you get 22,631 as the maximum total number of PALs in the United States. PALs, as I showed on the previous spectrum chart, are constrained to operate in the 3550 to 3650 megahertz portion of the band. They can't operate above 3650. A given operator can hold up to 4 PALs, meaning 40 megahertz in a county. So if you go to auction and buy PALs, you could buy at most 4 PALs in one county. As mentioned, PALs have to protect incumbents. And then PALs are protected in their own license area from co-channel interference from other PALs, and are also protected from co-channel interference from GAA. So that's the concept behind a Priority Access License, or PAL. You get interference protection from other PALs and from the lower tier of CBRS. Whoops. So the general authorized access, so that's the lowest tier of CBRS. It's lightly licensed. It's not unlicensed, but it's sort of like unlicensed. It still has to connect to a SAS to get permission to transmit, but other than that, there's no license you have to buy at auction. There's no a priori block size for GAA. In theory, a GAA could be anywhere from 5 to 150 megahertz in width. If, for example, it could have 150 megahertz if there were no other PALs operating, if no PALs operating in the area, and it didn't have to deal with coexistence with other GAA. That's exceedingly rare, but it's in theory possible. And 5 megahertz is the lowest block size that SASs currently support. So a GAA could have, in theory, between 5 and 150 megahertz of bandwidth. Typically, they have 20 or 30 or 40 megahertz of bandwidth. GAA operates under the same technical rules as PAL, so they can operate the same power levels and things like that, which I'll explain here in a minute. There's no difference there, but they just don't get the same amount of interference protection. GAA must protect incumbents and PALs, and GAA is not entitled to interference protection from incumbents, PALs, or other GAA, although SASs do their best to try to manage interference among GAA, but it's not required. So the technical rules, the Category A CBRS devices are allowed 1 watt per 10 megahertz maximum EIRP. And then there's a Category B, a higher power CBSD, which is allowed 50 watts per 10 megahertz. And then the end user devices that connect to these CBSDs, so the end user devices, or EUDs, are essentially the user terminals. Those are allowed 200 milliwatts per 10 megahertz, and it doesn't matter whether you're Category A or Category B CBSD in that case. So CBSDs must be fixed. You cannot have mobile CBSDs. And when they register with the SAS, they have to be geolocated to better than 50 meters horizontal and 3 meters vertical. If they move outside of that area or the uncertainty is too big, they have to re-register with the SAS. The user terminals, the EUDs, can be mobile, but there's no airborne operation of either CBSDs or EUDs allowed. You have to use digital modulation. It's not really a big requirement. Everybody does that now. CBSDs must work over the entire CBRS band. You can't design base stations that only work over a portion of the band. Category A can be, again, the lower power, Category A can be indoors, or they can be outdoors at height less than or equal to 6 meter height above average terrain. If the Category A device can't geolocate itself to the required accuracy, it has to be professionally installed. But if it can geolocate itself, it doesn't have to be professionally installed. At the moment, there are no Category A's that can geolocate themselves, so all of them have to be professionally installed. Category B, on the other hand, those have to be outdoors. You're not allowed to operate those indoors. There's no height limit. Again, airborne is not allowed, but other than that, there's no height limit. Category B's always must be professionally installed. And with regard to professional installation, the Wireless Innovation Forum, or WIN Forum, has created a certified professional installer program that will install CBSDs, and that has been very, very successful. So let's give an update on where CBRS operations stand currently, particularly with regard to where we were last year at this time. So there's not just one spectrum access system. There's actually, there's no limit on the number of spectrum access systems. A CBSD can connect to any spectrum access system that's been certified by the FCC. At the moment, there are 6 commercially certified, FCC certified spectrum access systems that are allowed to offer full commercial service. So there's a SAS operated by Amdocs, there's one operated by CommScope, there's one operated by Federated Wireless, there's one operated by Google, there's one operated by Keybridge. That's a recent certification that occurred a couple of months ago, and then there's one operated by Sony. And then the FCC has created, after the first wave of spectrum access systems applied to get certified some time ago, more than 2 years ago, the FCC opened a window for a second wave of spectrum access systems to get certified. Several people applied, and the FCC just recently, within actually this month, started conditionally approving these Wave 2 spectrum access systems. And so there's one from Fair Spectrum, there's one from Nokia, and there's one from Red Technologies that have been conditionally approved. What conditionally approved means is that it doesn't mean that they can offer commercial service. It means that essentially their application has been found to be in order, and they've been inserted into the pipeline to undergo certification testing and initial commercial deployments and things like that. But that will take some time to play out. So they cannot offer commercial service at this time, but they're on the path to get there. And then, as I mentioned earlier, and this is kind of becoming an important part of the CBRS ecosystem, are the ESC operators, the environmental sensing capability operators. There are currently 4 that are certified to provide ESC services. CommScope is one, Federated Wireless is one, Google is one, and then last summer, Keybridge also became certified to offer ESC service. There aren't actually 4 ESC networks operating. There's actually 3. Google and CommScope are operating their network together. So they do a joint ESC. So essentially there's 3 networks, the CommScope Google network, Federated network, and the Keybridge network. So CBRS by the numbers. This is an infographic that we make for the Wireless Innovation Forum website. Thanks to WIN Forum for providing the graphic. There was an auction, which I'll have a lot more detail here in a second, that was held last summer. It raised $4.6 billion for PAL licenses. There are more than 110 approved CBSD models that have been certified by the FCC. There are approaching 3,000 certified professional installers, which is an astonishing number. They've gone through the training programs and been actually certified to be CBRS installers. We're approaching actually 150,000 deployed CBSDs in the band since commercial service began last January. Not January 2021, but January of 2020. And that's ramping up quickly as the pandemic ends. Keep in mind that most of these deployments have been during the pandemic, so enterprise, indoor type things have taken a hit, but those are picking up now. And I have about 2,700 assigned PAL licenses already. PAL just kicked off. I'll give some details on that shortly. So the PAL auction. So this is probably the biggest. Well, this is the biggest event in CBRS that has occurred since we last met at NSMA. So July through August of last year was the PAL auction. There were 271 bidders who qualified to participate in the auction. That's a very large number. It goes to the heart of CBRS, and that is CBRS should, by its nature, be attracting a greater variety of entrants to get spectrum. The block sizes are smaller, the license areas are smaller, there's a lower barrier to entry, and so it's been very successful at attracting a greater number of qualified bidders. The auction went through 76 rounds. In the end, 228 of those 271 qualified bidders won at least one PAL, so 84% of the auction participants won at least one PAL. 91% of the licenses were won at auction, so 20,625 PALs were won at auction. 2,006 of the licenses were not sold and will most likely be auctioned at a later date or re-auctioned at a later date. The gross proceeds was approaching $4.6 billion. There were bidding credits offered to small businesses and very small businesses. And so when you deduct the credits that those entities got, the net proceeds from the auction was just over $4.5 billion. So even though the auction ended on August 25th of last year, the first set of PAL licenses were not issued by the FCC until March 12th of this year. It took the FCC a long time to go through all the long form applications and qualify all the bidders. I mean, there were a lot of licensees and there were a lot of licenses won. So it took over 6 months after the close of auction to get all these licenses granted. Nationwide, the average price went for about 20 cents per megahertz pop. And if you're interested, the highest price PALs by net bid, the four highest price PALs were in Los Angeles County, which went for about $52 million for 10 megahertz in that county. And then Cook County, Illinois, which includes Chicago, Orange County, California, and then San Diego County, California. The top bidders are listed there in the leftmost table: Verizon and Dish, Charter and Comcast, Cox, Southern California Edison, energy company, Windstream, Mediacom, Nextlake, and JBG Smith, a property development company, were the 10 largest bidders by net bid. And then the top bidders by number of licenses are listed on the right. Dish Network won the greatest number of licenses. They had a very extensive winning of licenses around the country. If you look at the bottom, the cumulative percent of the total bids listed there for the top 20 bidders, it shows you the top 6 bidders, took 90%, bid 90% of the money, and then the other 222 accounted for the other 10%. So it was a little top heavy, but still there were, a very large variety of winners, and some of these are rural internet service providers and things that just needed a license in the county or two in which they operate. And so that's why there's such a distribution. By market segment, this was broken down for us by Lee Pucker of Wireless Innovation Forum. So by number of licenses on the left, the operators and the wireless internet service providers were the bulk. By licensees. By an actual number of licenses, the operators were even more heavily represented. So, those include the MVNOs, the MNOs, MSOs, basically any sort of significant wireless operator, whether they're a traditional wireless carrier, cable operator, or something like that. So, interesting breakdown. So PAL channel assignment. So I've got the Tetris graphic up there because this really is pretty complex. So the auction, unlike most FCC auctions, did not include an assignment phase. So the FCC did not assign the specific block of 10 megahertz that each licensee got in each county. That was left to the spectrum access systems to assign, because that's the design of the system. In fact, by FCC rules, the SAS is assigned the PAL channels, and it has to the greatest extent possible, give them contiguity in geographic area. So if they have bordering counties, you want to try to give them the same channel in those counties. And then contiguity in frequency space. So if you have more than one 10 megahertz block, SASs are supposed to try to give them adjacent frequency blocks. So now if you take into account there's 3,323 counties, there were 20,625 licenses issued, there are 228 licensees, and the FCC wants you to assign all these channels in a contiguous fashion to the best you can in geography and frequency. That is an extremely complex mathematical problem. And the way we dealt with the complexity as SAS operators is we did this. We allowed the entities that won PAL licenses at auction to enter their own preferences for channels in each of their license areas into a portal that the SASs supported. And then the spectrum access system administrators collectively applied an algorithm to attempt a best fit based on the preferences that were submitted by all of the licensees and all of the license areas. And then once we did the first pass on that, the licensees were allowed a follow-up period to do a little bit of horse trading among themselves, to further optimize the distribution. The assignment process that just described started just as soon as the first list of approved licensees was issued back in March, and then the first PALs went live just a few weeks later on April 20th, 2021. So last month, almost exactly a month ago, the first PALs actually started coming online. And when you look at that, that was 9 months after the start of the auction. So this was not a particularly rapid process, but we are here now, so that's good. The idea is that the PAL channel assignments are intended to be static. PALs won't necessarily move around, although they will be given further opportunities to swap channel assignments going forward. And they could be changed channels if an incumbent like a DoD comes in and starts operating on one of their channels. They'll either be turned off that channel or temporarily relocated to another channel. But by default, the PAL channel assignments are expected to be static as much as possible. If you're interested in the gory details of the PAL channel assignment process, WinForm has a technical report on channel assignments. I've linked it there, and you can take a look at all the gory details. So let's look at CBRS in the bigger spectrum landscape at 3.5 gigahertz, because this is an important consideration here. So in the middle is the chart I showed previously, which shows the CBRS band in 3550 to 3700. But recently, the commission has either moved forward with or plans to move forward with services that will operate on either side of the CBRS band. So there's the 3.7 gigahertz service that'll operate just above the CBRS band. This is going to be done by relocating the fixed satellite service earth stations out of that band and deploying sort of a macro cellular type networks in the 3.7 gigahertz service. That was recently auctioned and raised a record amount of revenue, $81 billion, biggest take in an auction ever. And so those entities are keen to get building out, and they will basically be able to come online starting in December of this year in the lower 120 megahertz, and the upper 180 megahertz of the 3.7 gigahertz service should be available around December of 2023. George asked what the duration of a PAL license is. So yeah, the PAL license is 10 years with an expectation of renewal. So it's likely that the PAL holders will mostly keep their licenses forever. There are build-out requirements. They're not extensive, but there are build-out requirements. And then finally, so the 3.7 gigahertz service is a done deal. The 3.45 gigahertz service the rules have been adopted. As we heard earlier from Brian and Danielle, they're still working out some of the details related with the incumbency, and that incumbency has more DoD radars and things similar to what we're dealing with in CBRS, but actually more. And so there's going to be some geographic encumbrances that continue in that band. But the reason it's important to understand CBRS's position in the mid-band spectrum landscape is shown by this plot. So these are the EIRP limits that were adopted for the three services that are currently allowed in the 3 gigahertz band. So on the right is a 3.7 gigahertz service, and they're allowed an EIRP of as much as 3,280 watts per megahertz. In rural areas, in urban areas, it's half that, but it's still very high. The 3.45 gigahertz service is there on the bar on the left. They're also allowed 3,280 watts per megahertz for their service. Shown by the blue bar in the middle, the light blue bar in the middle, is the allowed CBRS maximum EIRP. And you say, what blue bar? It actually isn't visible at this scale because it's dwarfed by the other two services. But CBRS, the highest power CBRS is 5 watt per megahertz max. That's 28 dB, almost a factor of 1,000 less power than allowed for the other two services. So, CBRS is sort of sandwiched in between two very high power services, and there are some concerns that people have going forward with compatibility. So specifically with the red circles, I've sort of indicated where some of the trouble spots could be. The 3.7 gigahertz service abuts the general authorized access portion of the CBRS band, so that's a potential issue. And then the 3.45 gigahertz service abuts the priority access license and the general authorized access portion of the band, so that could be another issue. The FCC and some industry groups believe that doing time division duplex synchronization among 3.7 gigahertz service and 3.45 and the CBRS is one way to resolve that, although not every technology is capable of doing that. So we'll see how that works out. Another concern is finally the red oval there at the top left, and that is the 3.45 gigahertz service being immediately adjacent to the band where our environmental sensing capability sensors operate. And so we have concern about 3.45 gigahertz service overwhelming our ESC sensors. The FCC did not adopt any specific rules to deal with that, but we are hoping to be able to coordinate with the 3.45 gigahertz operators. And just to sort of give you a difference in the amount of bandwidth and money in 3.7 gigahertz compared to CBRS. So there's 280 megahertz available in the 3.7 gigahertz band compared to 150 in CBRS. But on the other hand, the top right plot shows there are much greater number of winning bidders in CBRS than 3.7. So it was very successful in sort of democratizing spectrum access. The net auction revenue, of course, dwarfs 3.7 gigahertz service with many times 81 billion compared to 4.5 billion. And then if you look at it on an auction revenue per megahertz pop, you're over 90 cents per megahertz pop in 3.7 gigahertz service and about 20 cents for CBRS. So it's about 4.5 times greater revenue per megahertz pop in 3.7 gigahertz compared to CBRS. So there have been petitions or ex partes recently about increasing the allowed power in CBRS to as much as about half as much as is allowed in 3.7 and 3.45. There's no formal proposal yet from the FCC to allow the higher power operations, but as you heard from Danielle this morning, Commissioner Carr would like to investigate the possibility of doing this. They claim it harmonizes better with the rest of the world and offers new use cases. So we'll see what happens there. The CBRS industry as a whole doesn't have a unified position on this, but it's something that we're following closely. This would be the proposal, the new proposal for 2 new categories of CBRS service: Category C at 164 watts per megahertz, and Category D at 1640 watts per megahertz. So it would become at least a fighting chance compared to the other services. But again, it sort of goes against the grain of what CBRS is for. It's really for lower power and greater number of licensees and better coexistence and denser deployments and offloads of macro networks and things. So we'll see how this shakes out. Maybe at next year's NSMA conference we'll have some results. And then finally, an important consideration here, informing incumbent capability. So if you go back to that plot I showed earlier, there was this informing incumbent portal. And in a few cases, instead of us sensing DoD operations, DoD actually pushes information about their operations to us by way of essentially a Google Calendar portal. They only do this at the inland radar sites. And they basically say, okay, at White Sands, we want to operate next Tuesday between noon and 4 p.m. local on 3550 to 3580 megahertz. That's what they push into the portal. The SASs get that information and they reconfigure CBSDs within a certain distance of White Sands, New Mexico, to make sure that the aggregate interference doesn't exceed the allowed amount. It's a very clean solution, very easy solution, doesn't require sensors, and not requiring sensors has turned out to be an important thing. Let me give you an idea of how the sensors work. So the NTIA, working with DoD, defines units of areas in which the coastal ships, the ships with the radar, may operate. And they call these chunks of geography, they call them dynamic protection areas, or DPAs. And what we do is we set up sensors. So the antennas for the sensors are sort of shown by the purple triangles there. We set up sensors on the lower edge and the upper edge of the DPA, pointing into the DPA, so that we cover any ship that turns on its radar in that DPA, and that alerts the SAS. That's a simplified view of how the ESC works, but there are DPAs that go all around the contiguous U.S. coastline and the Alaska coastline, and so we have sensors covering many of these DPAs. This is just one example of one DPA off the coast. Then when the SAS finds that particular DPA is active, that there's radar operation on a certain frequency in that dynamic protection area, it has to look at the aggregate interference coming from all of the CBSDs in a defined DPA neighborhood. The neighborhood was defined by NTIA, and that neighborhood is shown in green. It's a very large area. Some of these neighborhoods go more than 400 kilometers inland. Not to say that a CBSD on the far, exterior part of that DPA neighborhood is going to actually cause interference, but it must be considered in the aggregate interference calculation. This is all of the DPAs in the lower 48. Those are shown in red, and then their associated neighborhoods shown in green. And notice that a given point on the coast may be in more than one DPA neighborhood. So the challenge is that the sensors themselves create what we call a whisper zone. The sensors themselves have to be protected from CBRS interference so that they can hear the shipborne radar. And so what this creates is a zone around the sensors where we can't put CBSDs because otherwise they would exceed the interference criterion of the sensor. So it's sort of like a quantum mechanical effect. By sensing the band, we are impacting the band because we can't deploy CBSDs that will interfere with our own sensors. So we call these whisper zones, and they're becoming a little bit more problematic than we would have liked. Just as an example, on the left, in the purple areas and the yellow and the red areas, are areas where it would be very difficult to put a CBSD because it would cause interference to a nearby ESC sensor. So that, this is sort of the LA Long Beach area on the lower left. And so within that purple area, there's a very large population. And on the right is the sort of an equivalent plot for the New Jersey shore and Manhattan and Long Island. And you can see again that those purple, yellow, red areas where we can't put CBSDs are pretty impactful. We're trying to mitigate the impact of whisper zones, but it certainly is, it's a challenge, and we're trying to get over it. So what we're trying to do is we'd like to see ESCs, we'd like to see these sensors replaced with the informing incumbent concept. So that is, get rid of the sensors and just have the DoD provide us with information of where and when they need to be protected. It's a much cleaner solution because it gets completely rid of whisper zones. The incumbents control the information flow. They can provide us, better security than when we sense their actual operations. They can obfuscate their operations. They can, neglect to activate areas when they're just testing and they don't need actual protection. And it also reduces the number of false activations due to spurious detections. This does require a change in an incumbent's concept of operations, but overall, we think the benefit to the industry and probably the benefit to DoD is much greater. So we are the CBRS community generally is supportive of moving to an informing incumbent capability concept in the future. And we've been working with FCC, DoD, and NTIA to sort of explain what some of the challenges are related to whisper zones and why IIC is a good idea. DISA is actually running a competition to make sort of a battle-hardened version of our informing incumbent portal that's currently built on Google Calendar, and we're hoping that that's the prelude to doing a much larger scale IIC kind of deployment. So that's it. The most significant development from the last conference is the PAL auction. Overall, CBRS has been a great success. We're pushing 150,000 base stations. It's growing at about 1,000 per week. So quickly increasing the number of CBSDs. There are some challenges to address, the impacts of these adjacent band services, the management of whisper zone impacts, advocacy for transitioning to IIC over time. And then also what would be the impact of adding, category C or category D higher power CBRS operations. If that happens, what happens? Whisper zones become bigger and, coexistence becomes more of a challenge as well. So anyway, that's it. I wanted to leave a couple of minutes for questions anyway. So that's it. I'm glad to entertain questions either now or you can email me after the conference and let me know what you'd like to know. Thank you all.
Thank you, Andy. There's a lot of emoticons going up. I think folks were appreciated that, your detailed presentation. One question, just sort of very high level, in terms of customers, what do you see in terms of customer volumes over a period of years, sort of raw retail?
Well, I can say what's happened so far. A lot of the interest in CBRS has been from outdoor applications because indoor has been pretty much shut down. And so most of our, from the equipment side, most of the volume of sales have been for outdoor CBSD type equipment from wireless internet service providers, for example, or outdoor venue coverage, stadiums, things like that. The NFL is using this, by the way, for coach-to-coach communications. The PGA Tour is using this for ShotLink and other applications. So we've seen a lot of that type of activity. So because we've authorized 150,000 or so base stations so far, that gives you an idea of the volume of outdoor base stations. And again, we expect that number to grow rapidly now with the shutdown sort of coming to an end. As far as end user devices go, the end user terminals, that's harder for me to quantify. I don't really have visibility into the sales figures for end user devices. We just see it from the SaaS side, the base station side. But we're hoping that we'll be over 1 million or so devices before too long and continue to grow. So we think it's been very successful so far.
Awesome. And you saw earlier, George had asked about the duration of the PAL license.
Yep, 10 year.
Yeah. So
okay. But in reality, infinite because they have an expectation of renewal as long as they met their build-out requirement.
So if you were king for a day, how would you see the environment change, if at all?
Yeah, if I was king for the day, really, I would get rid of ESC. It was an interesting concept. It was a good concept to get us off the ground and mitigate interference into DoD radar incumbents. But in hindsight, ESC is too disruptive to the band. Having to sense the very band that you're trying to authorize service in just is two competing things. So I would move to IIC very quickly and get rid of ESC.
Yeah. All right. Well, King Clegg, we appreciate your time today.
Thank you,
as always.
Joe.
Yeah. And, that attention to detail is very helpful. And, a lot of us are obviously following it closely. And it sounds like it'll be a bigger and bigger market as days go on. So congratulations. I know you've been on this for quite a while.
Great.
So
Thanks, Joe.
thank you. We're jumping into a break and a short break, and then we'll be back with the human RF the panel discussion on human RF exposure. We won't be exposing humans. We'll be discussing. Thanks. Tip to Andy. All right. Thanks. Oh, one last question here. Lee Serbo.
Yep. And that is, that is correct. The CBSD should not function, it should not transmit until registered with a SAS, not just registered with a SAS, but also given authority to transmit by that SAS. That's a separate process. You register, then you request spectrum availability, and then you're given a grant, and then you are allowed to start transmitting. So there's a series of events that has to happen. So not just registration, but actual authority to transmit.
Excellent. All right. Thank you again for your time, and hopefully you'll come back with more as the years roll on this subject. Thanks so much.
Great. Thanks a lot. See you.
Okay.